Welcome to the Prime Venture Partners podcast. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Zhuo, who was formerly the design VP at Facebook from its early days. In fact, as I was researching this, I found that you started there as an intern and is now, the founder of a new company called Sundial, or co-founder of a company called Sundial. Welcome to the show, Julie.
Thanks, Amit. I'm glad to be here.
Julie, one of the things I was struggling with when I was preparing for our podcast is you have such a versatile background and a lot of different interests, right? You've written a book, The Making of a Manager. You have a lovely journey at Facebook. You're into obviously design and product thinking, etc. So I'm a little bit spoiled for choice here, but I'm going to focus our podcast here on building great products and great designs and some of the early lessons perhaps you learned at Facebook. So can you tell us about your early journey at Facebook, maybe even how you got started there, and we'll dive in from there.
Sure thing. So, I first became a user of Facebook, and it was a product that I loved. I was kind of obsessed with. All my friends were obsessed with it. That's because we were all in college when it swept through college as one of those hot social networks. And so my earliest memories of it was just writing on my friends' walls, right? And I would check every day. I would check to see who had uploaded a new photo. I would learn about new musicians and artists I should listen to from the profiles that my peers at school shared. And so when I graduated, I had just taken a class at Stanford about entrepreneurship. And coming into Stanford, I didn't really know anything about Silicon Valley, and I didn't know its history. I wasn't really sure exactly what it was. And then senior year, I take this class. It goes into a lot about, okay, what makes Silicon Valley famous? What is a startup? What is the VC ecosystem? A lot of those very basic questions. And it made me really excited about the prospect of just the idea of starting something from nothing, right? A small group of ragtag individuals forming a company, building something that becomes hugely valuable. And so I resolved that I wanted to go and work at a small company. And I had done some internships at Microsoft in the summers before, and that was great and all. I learned a lot, but after I took that class, I had my sights set of like, okay, I wanted to join a company. And so I looked around, I looked at what I was using. I had some friends actually who had joined Facebook just very recently, and I was thinking about an internship. So I decided to go and try my hand at applying for an internship at Facebook. And they didn't have an intern program. So I was like, that's okay, I'll just hire me anyway. I'll just come out for summer. By the way, I'm graduating soon. So, I was trying to, dangle the carrot of like, if it's a good experience, then I'll very quickly join full time. So it took me about 1 month to decide that I was just going to join full time. And so I converted actually halfway through my internship. I decided that I was going to, finish up my last semester at school while working full time because I loved what I was doing so much. And, when I joined Facebook, it was still a college and high school network. It wasn't very widely known. Most people had no idea what Facebook was. My mother was like, what? Like, are you sure you don't want to work for Microsoft? Like, I know Microsoft, it's a good company. But, I think that there was just this, I can't tell you, I can't, people ask me now, like, oh, when you joined Facebook, did you know it's going to be what it is today, right? Did you have a sense that it was going to be this huge thing and transform social networking? And I don't think the answer is yes. Definitely not when I was 22 years old, and I was, approaching. I just thought that this was a very good product, and I was also certain that it was a better product than MySpace or Orchid or any of the other competitor social networks. And I think that's pretty much what brought us all together. Everybody was pretty much at that time a college graduate or a college dropout. It felt in a lot of ways like an extension of what we had just come from in college. And we were also the primary users of our product, and getting into talking about product thinking. And I think that's one of the reasons why it took off so well, right? Because initially it was a product for college and high school students by college students. And so our early intuition about what people like us wanted was spot on, because we were designing for ourselves and our friends. And that was how we did stuff. We would just dream up an idea. We would talk it over with some of our friends. They would tell us it's stupid, or they would say this is a great idea. we'd hack all night and we'd build it, kind of it was an extension of school. So we were all like night owls, and we would be listening to Daft Punk while coding until 4 or 5 a.m. And yeah, and that was the early days of Facebook.
Very, very interesting. Lots of follow on questions, but let me pick on the product one, which is that how do you, you went from that sort of very modest beginning, right? Only for high school and colleges and so forth, with I think 100 people is what I read when you joined them, to, hundreds of millions and billions of users, right? Across multiple products and features. And, you guys then went on an acquisition spree with Instagram and all that. But obviously you could not continue to empathize with the user all along, right? When you were a college student and you joined right out of college, that's great. Then how do you kind of build that, customer empathy, both from a design and a product point of view as it scaled?
We had to learn that lesson the hard way. So early on in its first few years, there was a couple of things that Facebook invented. We were one of the first companies to do photo tagging, right? I think Flickr invented the idea of tagging, various entities, but we did it with people. So we could say, I could take a picture of the two of us, and I could say, this is a picture of me and Amit. And you would get that photo on your profile. It would show up, in newsfeed. You would be alerted to it. You would see it. And wildly popular. Very quickly, Facebook became one of the top photo sharing sites in the world, even though we had like a fraction of the features of all of our the big photo sharing competitors. Right? We didn't offer high res photos. We didn't really have even like a beautiful navigation. We made it's kind of actually hard to really navigate, but we did have this photo tagging feature, which meant you could look up Amit and you could look at all of the photos anyone had taken of you that was you were friends with and had tagged you, and people loved that. So that was one thing we invented, hugely successful, and we were like, yes, this is working. Next thing, newsfeed. It came out from our own observation that every day what we would do is we would log on to Facebook and we would ask, we would wonder, hey, who updated their profile, right? What new bands did they add? What new photos did they add? And so we had this pattern that we ourselves were doing and that we recognized all of our friends were doing, which is you log on to Facebook, then you would search for your first best friend. You would go look at their profile. You would say, did anything change? Okay, nothing, great. Next friend, load their profile. Did anything change? Oh, cool, they added some new bands. Interesting. Next profile, photos, and so forth, right? So every day the same habit. And we thought, that's really repetitive and that's just a lot of work. Like, why don't we just make a feature where we could just tell you everything that changed from your friends so you don't have to go and do that? And we did that. And actually that one was an interesting story because we launched Newsfeed. We were sure that everybody would love it because we were like, we just solved this problem. We just saved you like 10 minutes of your day. We can just show you stuff and you'll never miss anything, interesting that happened with your friends. And we were wrong because people were up in arms about this feature. They really hated it. They thought that it was creepy. They thought that, suddenly like this thing is following me and tracking me and telling my friends what I've been doing. And we instantly, within I think a week or so, 10% of the user base joined a group that said, I effing hate the Facebook newsfeed. This is the thing that actually put us on the map because nobody was paying attention to Facebook before this. We're a small college, high school site, right? And then it was almost like such a big story that news report, like CNN and everybody, like they were all reporting on it because the story was, wow, there's this college site and they did this thing that so many of their users hated and are protesting and like, haha, isn't this funny? And that was how we first made kind of national news, and the first time that kind of Facebook became the story. But what we noticed is that even though people were saying they hated it, they were using it. Like usage of newsfeed shot up. And not to mention, the only reason that 10% of the user base were able to join this group is because they saw it on newsfeed. They wouldn't have been aware of the fact that this I hate the newsfeed group existed if not for the fact that they were on newsfeed all day long and checking it out and being made aware of things. And so Mark made a tough call then, but it was absolutely the right one, where he said, even though people are saying they hate it, their behavior is telling us that there's something valuable here. And we, instead of just rolling it all the way back, as many people were at the company were saying, look, we should roll it back. People hate it. We got to give them what they want. He said, no, let's just listen to what their concerns are. Their concerns are that they want more control over which stories get published or not. Let's just build that. And so we had a team hack on it for like overnight, and they introduced, a bunch of controls for what appears on newsfeed, and newsfeed stayed and thrived and continued to grow. Okay, so that's 2 stories now where we've trusted our instinct and it totally worked out. Eventually, this method started to fail. I think this was about 2 or 3 years after I joined, and we had a series of other types of, what we thought were, again, marquee events that we were going to ship. One of them was called graph search, right? And it was the idea that you could, instead of just searching by keyword, I could say, show me photos of Amit from 2017 and just get all the photos. It was sort of like a smart, graph query oriented search. And we thought it was this huge thing, totally failed. Like nobody used it. There was like 2 other projects like that, where we thought it was amazing, it came up with it intuitively, and they totally failed. And that was when we realized the lesson that we had at that point grown our user base so that it was no longer mostly college and high school students, and our sense of what the user base wanted started to become, less and less good at predicting what they actually wanted, because at that point we had added lots of people throughout the United States. We had started to expand internationally. We had some people who are less savvy, technically speaking, when they came onto the site, and that was when we realized we really had to change our method of product development. We had to become much more rigorous about understanding the pulse of the user base instead of relying so much on our own intuition. That was also when we decided that we needed to start testing stuff much earlier and not just one day flip the switch and say, hey, here's this feature for everyone, but we needed to, make sure it goes to a small market first and we see how they react, and we make sure that it's good before we, turn up the switch.
Very interesting. I want to kind of drill down later into the role of data versus gut, and kind of you already alluded to that. I want to go back to the photo tagging feature, and particularly in a large, rapidly growing brand such as Facebook, even back 12 years ago, 13 years ago, which is that how do you pick what to build or not build? And I found this interesting kind of framework that I saw you speak about, which is how do you how a Facebook designer thinks, and it has 3 questions. What people problem are we solving? How do we know it's a real problem? And how will we know if we've solved for it? Certainly the first 2 are pretty relevant, but when you're being inundated with, let's do photo tagging, let's do newsfeed, let's do like button, and I'm sure there were like a million other things, how do you pick what to do, both as a combination of gut and data? If you can talk us through that. And this is again more relevant, I mean, trying to apply it to more early stage or early growth companies today.
Yeah, and I go back to that framework all the time because I think it's a simple way to kind of think about, often, and good ideas, right? Good ideas for features, for products come from everywhere. They come from observing someone using their product. They come from, internal engineers, PMs, designers, like everybody has ideas. And so we go back to that framework of, ultimately, it used to be what would happen is that sometimes someone would say, hey, I've got a great idea for a product. We should do X. And before we get into thinking about X, what is X? Is X, how should you implement X, or what should it look like? That's where the first question that you just quoted kind of came in, right? That instead of focusing on the solution, we first need to ask ourselves, well, what problem are people having? And let's just make sure we really understand that problem, because we can't just go into the solution if we don't quite have alignment on what is the actual problem, right? And the second question helps us understand the priority of that problem. So the second question is, how do we know it's a real problem? And maybe another way to think about it is how big of a problem is it, right? Because is it just a problem for you? Like, are you this like special niche user that's very very techie, and you really want it to work a certain way, but you're like one of 10 people who want that? I mean, that's a real problem for you perhaps, but it's just not a real problem in the sense of like many people have this problem, right? So the second question is meant to try and help us quantify what is the, let's say, depth or extent or scope of how bad this problem is. And ideally, we can pick on the things that are real problems, that we can understand them and are like pretty big opportunities or big problems that, when you give people a solution or you give people a better way, they're just like, yes, that's absolutely what I want. And that really resonates with me. So those two questions are sort of meant to help us with that level of prioritization. And then the third question, how will we know if we've solved it, is to try and keep us honest on what behaviors or what would we see that would give us indication that whatever we came up with was successful. And it sometimes fights against this bias that we all naturally have. Sometimes we think we understand the problem. Great, we think it's a big problem. We build something and we're looking, we're biased, so we're always looking for like reasons to believe that we did well, right? We're looking for any positive sign of like, oh yes, like this person said something good, and we tend to latch on to the positive feedback much more so than we might be willing to look at or admit the negative feedback or the graph that isn't growing or whatever it is. And so by trying to define the criteria of what success looks like, what would we have seen in the behavior, what would people have told us, what would have changed about their habits or whatnot, like by trying to ask that question way up front, we try and make it so that we have a more objective criteria set up at the beginning, so we're not like looking at a bunch of metrics after the fact and then trying to piece it together and into the best possible interpretation.
Right. So the question is on the first one, and I often get this pushback and hates, I mean, I really hate it, right? Which is, hey, look, if it's a latent problem, people don't even know that they have a problem, right? Like the classic Steve Jobs thing or whatever, saying, I can see that you have this problem, but you don't even know it yet. Any thoughts on that? Because even like your profile idea, right? I mean, you saw it because every day you would go to different people's walls and see what had changed and stuff like that. But often people may not realize that I want to know what has changed in my friend's profile or what's happening in the world or what's happening in the news feed. So any thoughts on uncovering sort of more latent problems, or you just experiment?
Um, you're absolutely right that, if I just go and ask a user, hey, what problems do you have? And then they might list a couple things, but they may actually have a lot of opportunity in their daily lives that they don't know the maybe to call it a problem, or they can't imagine what a better solution might look like. And so I do agree that oftentimes you're not going to get maybe the best ideas for things just by asking people. I mean, you should ask and you'll get some signal, right? Especially the stuff that's obviously broken, but not all of the best product ideas come from what people say explicitly that they have a problem with. I think there's another way to look at what are opportunities or problems, which is by observation and by, for example, if you shadow someone for a day and you look at what they're actually doing, you as a third party observer may recognize that some things that they're doing is slow, it's inefficient, or like, geez, like they're like, if were you aware that technology could help you automate all of this stuff and save you like 30 minutes, and so I do think that that's why user research, especially the kind of research where ethnographic research where you just actually watch people or you try to understand how they live their day-to-day life, or how they or if you are researching your own product, how it is that they incorporate your product into their daily lives, right? And that just oftentimes quietly watching can give you a ton of inspiration, that can augment what you ask them and what they explicitly tell you they wish could be better about your product. But this is also where we get into things like looking at data, which I know we'll talk about soon. Oftentimes, if you look at the data, it could also present opportunities, right? If you find that there's a huge drop off in a funnel between steps B and C, it's probably something for you to look into. Like, why are people dropping off there? Is that expected? Is that not? Let's go into it. And you may find opportunities to improve whatever is the user experience between steps B and C. So looking at data is another way of finding problems. I think the third way that I like to think about it is like, a lot of human needs have been quite universal and unchanged in all of history, right? There's just different formats for us to express that. I think there's the idea. I think one person that I heard, which I kind of liked, I don't necessarily have negative framing, but it's sort of like every problem is maybe in some variation of the seven deadly sins. It's like gluttony or envy or
Yes.
and so the idea of, let's say, newsfeed, right? It just boils down to like you don't want to you don't want to feel FOMO. You don't want to feel left out. You don't want to feel like you missed the news or you're not in on what happened. And I think that's been true in all of history, right? Like that, humans have always wanted to feel like they were a part of something and that they were clued in on what was happening. And, newsfeed is just a manifestation of another way to maybe improve that, but it's not the end of it. Like I still think that desire continues, and we can see it in the way that people respond to things like push notifications or whenever there's alert about something that might have happened to you. And you can see a lot of retailers also utilize that particular need with things that seem like scarcity, or that it's like, this is a sale that's happening for today only, right? And so they're all tapping into a lot of these same desires, and I think that every product is just another way of doing something that expresses one of those human basic desires.
I want to go back to the ethnographic research, and we often recommend it, but think of yourself in the current role as a co-founder of a young early stage company. How do you do that, right? It seems too rich, right, to say, "Oh, let's hire an ethnographic researcher or a UX researcher," and you could go the other extreme where you could be the kind of fake foot doctor, just saying, "I'll just go talk to 30 users, and whatever I learn is what I'm going to go do." Any suggestions for how to kind of hack it till you can afford to get a formal researcher or a agency to help you with this kind of ethnographic research work?
Yeah, so my perspective on how you start out and what your approach to product development is when you're at a very early, let's say you're founding something, right? Or you're going from 0 to 1 versus 1 to n. I think they're actually two very different approaches. So if you're going from 0 to 1, oftentimes it does behoove you to work on a problem that you personally understand very well, or that you yourself are a target user, or people who are target users, something that speaks to your personal experience. Because then you can trust your intuition a little bit more, right? You are somebody who has experienced this, this problem, you felt it quite deeply, you know probably other people who experience this problem, and a lot of times it gives you that mission and that meaning for why you should tackle this problem because you have that personal connection to it. Now, it is possible that you can just approach a very blank slate, and you can say, look, I just want an interesting problem. It doesn't have to be personally connected to me. Let me go and just talk with a bunch of people and figure out what that opportunity is. And that is one way of doing it. But I find that, and I think Paul Graham gives this advice, it's like, go first build something that you yourself would want, because it does then make it so that you can cut down on all of those steps of needing to talk to 100 customers because you can't trust your own intuition, right? You can, and therefore you should go from that. And that's what we're doing with Sundial. I mean, it came from a lot of our experience of building products and relying on data. Not to mention, my co-founder Chandra was a data scientist himself. He's managed a lot of data scientists. He's looked at data at a lot of companies. So he has a lot of, personal knowledge and domain expertise for this field, which really, helps guide our initial assumptions, right? But also in our early days, we are trying to talk to customers, and our customers in this case are other high growth companies, and really get to hear their stories. Ask them very basic questions like, what what do you struggle with, or what questions do you have on a day-to-day basis when it comes to your data? Like, what would you like to know? And sometimes we'll send out surveys, or we'll just meet one-on-one with them and try and actually use that to validate our own assumptions about what the biggest problems are that customers have. And then when we design our initial version, I think quite quickly on, we started to ask experts in our field, right? Other people who were executives, who were leaders of data science at various companies, or who are very familiar with it, to just drop in and just critique our work. Look at our idea, tell us what they thought was important, what wasn't important, and that's not expensive. We're not going out and hiring an ethnographic researcher or an agency. We're just going and inviting people who are other folks who have a deep understanding of the problem and the domain space, and getting other external eyeballs on our thinking and our solution from the very, very early days, right? But even before we have, the semblance of a solution, or before we've even written much code, we were trying to have a process like that. And I think we will continue to do so even as we develop these first initial versions.
Let's move towards the data part of this equation, right? And in particular, again, the framework we cited, the two questions: is it a real problem, and like measuring, have we made progress or made a dent towards solving this problem? Were there any obvious kind of metrics or frameworks that you used, other than like increase CTR or NPS goes up, that helped you, and that may be relevant for others as well?
Yes, the most important thing that I've learned about data is that this is, goes back to that third question. How do we know that we've solved it, right? And I think what solving it means is oftentimes not like a metric going up. I think we always have to keep in mind that metrics are a proxy for the change that we want to see in the world. As an example, when we came out with Facebook, right, our vision was that everybody in the world would feel connected. They would feel like they could easily access the people who are close to them. They would feel, like they understood what was going on with the people who were close to them, that they had tools to express themselves however they wanted, whether it was to their best friend or their parents or to their college alumni network or to the public at large. And so, we felt that maybe the best incarnation of like, did we succeed, would be if we could go out and we could talk to every single person and we can ask them, and we could maybe not even ask them because, again, people don't always tell you what it is they truly feel in the survey. But if we could actually, almost like, and if we had a magic wand, it's like we could read their minds and we could know to what degree Facebook and the tools help them feel more connected to the people in their lives. Like, that's actually what, fulfilling that mission would be, right? The problem is, we can't go and read people's minds, okay? And we probably can't even talk to everyone in the world. So we need
Yes.
to look at what is the best proxy that helps us understand if we're, on the right track or if we're doing that. And so the first thing we have to do before we end up looking at any kind of data is like, map out your vision. Like, what does the change you want to happen in the world truly look like? If you can, call it the wave the magic wand technique, right? Wave the magic wand. What's different? What would people tell you? What would they feel? What would they do? Then you have to have that in your head first to then be able to say, okay, now let's figure out which metrics, and I say metrics rather than any one metric. I'm a big believer that no single metric can truly tell you what it is to know. I mean, I think, again, we humans have this bias where we want that clarity. Like, when we make decisions, it would be great if we knew that we were successful if this one number went up, and if we knew we were failing if that one number. Like, there's something very elegant and simple and like actionable about that. But the problem is, the real world is quite complex. There's no one metric that is the end all and be all. Every single metric is a proxy for what you really care about. And so the best thing that happens is you then need to look at probably a basket of metrics, right? And this is where we get into kind of the art of, choosing the right goal metrics, like choosing the right number. You don't want 20 because you can't even keep 20. I can't even list off like 20 things in my head, right? And if, like, if you had 20 and then some of them went up and some of them down, it's like very hard to get an accurate story in your head about like, well, how are actually things going? But you also don't want one. And so, the right art of it is like, okay, how do you select the right basket that that again serves as a good proxy? Again, also with counter metrics and other weights that happen in place, right? So one of the problems, you mentioned CTR as an example. One of the problems with CTR is it's, every metric is probably easy to game if you set that as a team's goal, right? If I said, hey, we're going to judge success of this team on whether they can drive the CTR of this particular button, then they're going to make the button red. They're going to make it flashing. They're going to promise you like $100 if you click on this button. Like, there's lots of ways to get someone to click on the button, but that may not actually serve what is the purpose that your product is trying to do. And so, you probably don't want to look at CTR. You probably want to look at something like, retention. And actually, retention is a very, very good metric, and it's something that I think is often underlooked, right? It's usually oftentimes when companies look at, what is a good product, they look at growth. They look at how quickly has it grown, how many users does it have, how many did it have a month ago. And for new products, I generally think you got to look at retention before growth, because retention is more correlated with, well, if your product is really great and someone used it once, are they coming back? And if they come back a lot, then that probably is a better signal that you've made something valuable, more so than if you were able to drive the top line growth number, because lots of people can be coming through the door. And if they don't buy anything and they don't come back, then that's not really good for you. It's not really a sustainable business. And so regardless, there is some art to picking the right number of metrics, picking the right set of metrics that really encapsulates what you feel success is, and what the behavioral or outcome change that you want for people are. And the other art of the metric is that you want it to kind of be operational, right? So the problem with retention is great, again, for knowing if your general product is good enough that people are going to come back. Part of the challenge is that it's not terribly operational. And what I mean by that is it's very hard to run a small experiment and have it actually impact top line retention, right? And so it's not, it's more of a lagging indicator, right? If you know you've got it, or you don't have it, but it's, if you just run like, let's say 10 or 20 minor experiments, it's really not going to change top line retention much. And so therefore it's not a great metric to help you understand how you should make micro level decisions, like should I go with redesign A or redesign B? And so a good metric is, again, both a good proxy for your value, but is also something that is that is sensitive enough that you can use it to help you make decisions about specific launches, specific tests, specific other things, right? And because you do need to launch a test, and you need to know, like, okay, should I broaden this launch? Like, is this a good feature? Is it not? And you kind of need to look at something that goes up or down to help you make those decisions. So that's another factor that goes into kind of the art of choosing the right metrics or looking at the right data.
I love this. I don't think I've heard this before, that metrics are a proxy to measure the change you wish to see in the world, or you anticipate to see in the world. Very, very interesting on that. I just crowdsourced a couple of questions from Twitter right before we got on the air a couple of hours ago. And there were several themes, so we won't be able to cover all, but I want to pick two. One is, how do you drive communication between design, product, business, customer service, the whole nine yards, and maybe any kind of best practices there, both at the early stage, especially at the shipping velocity that you guys were at, and as you kind of scaled up. So that, let me just start with that particular one.
Yeah. That's a great question. I think about it in sort of two dimensions. The first is, does everyone understand the why for why we're doing what we're doing, right? So yeah, it's easy for us to communicate the what, right? But what's more important is the why, and that means, is everyone aligned on the problem that we're trying to solve? Is everyone aligned on what this is meant to do for people? And if you think about it, right, the designers do have a different language than engineers or PMs. And what I mean by that is, like, designers will often talk about things that, maybe engineers or PMs don't really understand. Like, this page needs to breathe better, or this page, like, we need to go and make it cleaner or more minimal, right? And oftentimes that doesn't really resonate with like an engineer or a PM. And similarly, a PM might say something like, we need to improve the CTR on this thing, and that might not resonate with like a designer. But what I think everybody can get behind is the language of users, and what we are trying to do for people, right? What is the change that we want people to see? How do we want people to feel? What actions do we want people to take? Do they, we want them to feel confused or not, or whatever it is, right? We want them to feel excited to make a purchase because, like, oh my gosh, like, this is such a good deal. Like, everyone can understand the impact on the ultimate customer. So I always find that's the sort of the foundational, like, common ground language. And I think that if we're talking past each other, or we're we don't understand the goal, let's go back to, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we want to do something for people, for our customers, for our clients. Let's talk about what we're trying to do in the language of what we're trying to achieve for people, right? And so if we can do that, then it is much easier to actually talk about what the priorities should be, or if we disagree about this approach versus that approach, like, which one has the best outcome for people. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing that also helps is, again, to get to being able to, like, what does it mean to get to a good operationally rigorous culture, right? It does mean that things have to be tangible, and that's where you get to, it's so important to set clear proxy metrics and to select a good set of proxy metrics. So again, everyone understands the story, what we're trying to do. Everyone understands why, these are the proxy metrics that we believe are operational and that can help us understand whether things are good or not. And also everyone understands why they map to, our version of success, right? And that way, most people will then be able to function, with the idea of like trusting these metrics and what they say about certain tests. But you also can tell if one day you get, a result where the metric went up, but your intuition about this is that maybe it's not a great experience for some reason. And if you understand why the metric was chosen and what the potential blind spots are, right, with the metric that doesn't quite cover it, you will then be able to still dig a little bit deeper to find the truth of whether this thing is a good or not experience based on, your understanding of the why and how the proxy metrics were selected.
Great. Many more questions, Julie, but this is a good segue into what you're doing now at Sundial, which is, how to make kind of data informed decisions using, obviously data, gut, the why, the proxy metrics, etc. So can you talk to us a little bit about kind of melding these two threads of data and intuition, maybe even an example or two, perhaps, to continue with the Facebook journey on where you were made misinformed decisions, right? Or kind of
Yeah.
data led you to the wrong answer, or your gut led you to a wrong answer. So let's talk about bringing these together now, data and gut.
Yeah, I have like 1,000 examples of times when my gut was wrong. Mostly when it comes to things at scale, like when we actually launched our product to billions of people, right? And again, most of the average user is looking very, very different from, my colleagues and I's experience, living in the San Francisco Bay Area in America, working for a tech company. And I remember the best example of this was a redesign of the web that we were thrilled about. We called it Lightstand. And the whole idea is that we were going to make the Facebook newsfeed experience a lot more immersive, and that meant that we were going to, widen the site, right? We were, operating from like an 800 and 600 type of resolution, and now, computer hardware had gotten a lot better. Everything was faster. People were on, machines with better performance. So we thought we need to make everything bigger. We need to make it more immersive. This will be so amazing. We'll be able to show photos, so much richer than before. And we spent a lot of time building this beautiful design. And I remember we presented it, to the press, and it was very well received. Everybody was very, very excited about it. So then we started to test it out to a particular market. Remember, we had learned our lesson now. We don't just flip the switch. We go and just test it to like 2%. And every metric tanked. Everything that we cared about went down. And I was convinced that this was a bug. It was like, okay, something was wrong. Like it must be performance related, right? Because maybe we just had a bug and made everything like a second slower, and that's why everything's going down. And we went and just investigated, every possible thing that this could be. And it was actually very difficult because we bundled like, I don't know, like hundreds of changes into this one giant redesign. That's a big lesson for us. We never did that again. We always afterwards did redesigns in chunks so that we didn't have to go and try and claw our way back into like which feature is the one responsible for why everything's going down. So it took us quite a few months to get to the bottom of it. And what we realized is we made a big mistake by assuming that everybody had, large, like wanted larger screens, right? In fact, a lot of the world was still operating off of these, very small laptops with pretty limited resolution. And on those laptops, one of our photos, if your friend posted a photo, it would not fit on the viewport. It was like the photo was just too big for your viewport, which of course is a terrible experience, right? For anybody, if that's your what you're trying to see for newsfeed. And just so people, got fed up and they just used it less because it was a worse experience. And it sounds very obvious in retrospect that we should have realized this, but I think, again, we had all been, the entire company was using, very nice computers, big monitors. None of us had ever gotten one of these, like none of our relatives, or even maybe like our friends were operating in these, laptops that were a couple of years old and that had low of resolution, but enough of the world is still a significant enough chunk that this was frankly a much worse experience for them, and we ended up having to basically redesign the whole thing again, to fit for that. And that was one very hard earned lesson, to do a lot more of this, to again break up large assumptions into smaller ones that we could understand and test much more piecemeal, and to not get too precious about any beautiful redesign, because like again it may not be what it's just, if it's not representative of what the user base sees, then it can only be appreciated by a very small fraction of that user base. So that's one thing that we've learned. I mean, there's a lot of other things where we continue to use our intuition, right? And one big area that I think really matters is, like, whenever you're coming up with a new product, or you're coming up with something, a new feature that didn't exist before, data can't lead you to the answer of what it is you should build. Data can help you identify problems, can help you identify where might be the opportunities, but it isn't going to help you invent the next thing, right? You still have to have some assumptions. You have to still rely on certain observations or things where you're like, this is something that is a unique approach to this problem, or this is something that quite hasn't been done before. This is something that is similar to what someone else does, but with a unique twist, that helps us do this in a better manner, right? You still have to have a spark of what makes for a good experience, and that for anything that's 0 to 1, I'm still a firm believer that you can't data analyze your way into what is the right thing to build. So those are examples of how I think of the balance. But if you are thinking about scaling, and you're thinking about iterating, or you're thinking about growing a thing, or you're thinking about like, do people like icons and labels versus just text labels versus icons in order to represent an idea, that's the kind of stuff that you should just A/B test, and the data will tell you which of these is more impactful. And by the way, the answer to that is icons plus labels. That works better. Then the second best is text, and the third best is icons. As much as I, as a designer, love minimal icons, that is just not as effective or as usable for the vast majority of the world. Yeah, at least at this point.
Wonderful, Julie. Great. Maybe just a quick summary of what Sundial is, and and I'm sure it'll help lots of high growth companies leverage both data and intuition and figuring out the why as they go building. As we wrap up here.
So you could tell that I'm pretty passionate about this idea of data and design. What Sundial tries to do is that it is a storytelling product that helps product companies understand the most important narrative of their data and how to turn that into actionable insights. And so the problem that we're trying to solve, because again, we always start with people problems, is that today what happens is, we're all logging everything, right? So we have tons of data, we have probably tons of dashboards, but you and I can look at a dashboard, 16 charts, and we could walk away with a completely different interpretation about how our business is doing. You might be looking at one chart, it's going up to the right, you're patting yourself on the back, you're happy. I'm looking at some other chart, in our business, and it's going down, and I'm like really stressed out. And so even though we're looking at the exact same raw facts, our interpretation of the data is different. And if our interpretation is different, it's hard for us to then align on what is the right product strategy going forward. And this is why companies hire data scientists. Their whole job is to go and look at this and try and contextualize the data, come up with the right narrative. And our product is trying to automate a lot of that work to make it easier for data scientists to not have to run the same automated repetitive manuals, and to do that in a way that focuses on telling the story in an easy to understand and digestible manner. So data storytelling is, it's a very interesting area for me to think about, even personally from a design perspective. I've always been somewhat intimidated as a designer, looking at all these like crazy numbers and charts. I've had to learn oftentimes, the hard way, but I'm sort of very sensitive to just like the fact that it is hard to grok, right? Again, if you don't feel like you're a quantitative person who understands statistics, it's hard to understand. And I think we should be able to democratize that and make it so that every builder knows what's going on, knows the right story, and then knows how to take action on it.
Thanks a ton, Julie. We wish you all the very best with Sundial. I'm sure you'll do great, and we look forward to using the product as it comes out. Thank you again for being on the Prime Venture Partners podcast.
Thanks so much. This was so fun.
Dear listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast app for free, and you'll be the first one to know when new episodes are available. Just search for Prime Venture Partners podcast in Apple Podcast, Spotify, Castbox, or however you get your podcasts. Then hit subscribe. And if you have enjoyed the show, we would be really grateful if you leave us a review on Apple Podcast. To read the full transcript, find the link in the show notes.